At my son's rooftop award dinner, he told me I didn't belong. His wife smirked and suggested I eat at a deli instead. I just smiled and left quietly. What they didn't know was that the entire tower, his clinic, his empire, was mine. Weeks later, the world found out, and their faces turned pale. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. They once said genius was born, not made. But if anyone had asked Margaret Hale, she would have told them that genius is carved out of bone-deep sacrifice, stitched together with sleepless nights, and sustained by hands that learn to endure. Margaret was 37 the night her life split in two. A police officer arrived at her modest home, cap in hand, voice trembling with the kind of practiced sympathy that feels both heavy and hollow. Her husband had been struck by a drunk driver on his way back from the night shift. The man she had shared quiet breakfast with, who fixed bus engines with gentle hands and hummed folk songs under his breath, was gone in an instant. At his funeral, she held the small hand of her son Daniel, who was only 9. His eyes were too wide, too knowing for a boy his age, and he clutched at her dress as though afraid she might vanish too. The insurance barely covered the burial, leaving nothing to carry them forward. Margaret had no degree, no family inheritance, no backup plan, just a fragile boy with a cough that always came early when winter set in. So she did what desperate women have always done. She worked. The library was hiring, a quiet place with steady pay at minimum wage. The job didn't come with benefits, but it came with routine. Margaret stacked books until her palms blistered, learned the Dewey Decimal System until it pulsed through her like second nature, and smiled at strangers who never knew that behind her calm expression was a woman fraying at the edges. Every morning began at 5 o'clock a.m. She boiled oatmeal, packed Daniel's lunch, and laced her shoes even when their soles had long split apart. Snow clung to her hem as she walked 5 blocks to the library, frost biting at her ankles. But she never once let her son go hungry. She made him a promise in the silence of those aisles. Daniel would never feel poor. When other children went to summer camp, she picked up extra shifts to afford science camp instead, because Daniel's eyes lit up at the thought of telescopes and lab coats. When his friends wore new backpacks, she skipped out her own dental checkups so he could have one with sturdy straps and enough compartments to hold every dream he scribbled on paper. She glued her own shoes again and again, curling the leather until it looked like it was pleading for mercy, but Daniel never noticed. She didn't want him to, and when he opened the acceptance letter from Johns Hopkins, Margaret cried for 2 days straight, not out of pride, though it pulsed through her like sunlight, but because she couldn't make the numbers add up. Tuition, books, rent, food. She would have to work weekends, take evening shifts in the archive, let go of the small cleaning jobs she did for her neighbor. She stretched her life like a rubber band, pulling at every corner until it threatened to snap. But she did it quietly, without fanfare. When Daniel walked across the stage at his white coat ceremony, Margaret didn't sit in the audience. She told him she had caught a cold. The truth was she couldn't afford the flight. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, watching the live stream. She saw him stride forward, posture tall, smile wide, a future gleaming in the cut of his suit. And though her heart swelled, it also ached. She was full, empty, and full again, all at once. That is the strange paradox of motherhood. You give until your name fades from the story, and still it is not enough. As the years passed, Daniel grew into a man Margaret barely recognized. His suits were sleek, his watch platinum, his wife, Vanessa, beautiful but sharp-edged, with a smile that never reached her eyes. Vanessa greeted Margaret with the politeness reserved for strangers in elevators. Margaret wasn't invited to their wedding. Daniel claimed it was a small gathering. Later, photographs bloomed online, 300 guests, a Tuscan garden, champagne towers rising like monuments. Margaret stayed silent. Every birthday, she sent Daniel a card. Each Christmas, she baked cookies. With every job change, she mailed a handwritten letter of pride. She kept her distance because that was what he seemed to want. But a mother always hopes. She hoped that one day he might turn back, see her clearly, and whisper the words she had never once demanded but always longed for. Thank you, I remember. That day never came. Still, Margaret's love held steady, invisible but unbreakable, the way a foundation supports a tower without ever being acknowledged. And beneath that silence, beneath the years of sacrifice that had carried her boy into the world's applause, something fragile began to tremble. Not anger, not yet, but the beginning of an awakening. Because no matter how much the world tried to erase her, Margaret Hale was not gone. Daniel Hale became everything the world admired and nothing his mother recognized. Success wrapped around him like a second skin, gleaming and cold. His shoulders straightened into authority, his stride carried confidence, and his voice took on the smooth cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He was brilliant. No one could deny that. But brilliance has a way of casting shadows, and in his light, Margaret Hale slowly disappeared. He wore expensive suits that shimmered faintly under restaurant chandeliers, the kind of fabric you could only find in boutiques that locked their doors at night with golden keys. A platinum watch rested on his wrist, ticking in silence as though even time had bent itself to his schedule. Beside him, Vanessa Cole radiated the kind of elegance born not of warmth but of calculation. Her eyes sparkled in photographs, but her smile never softened at the edges. To Margaret, it felt like Vanessa smiled at her the same way one does at a stranger who accidentally enters the wrong elevator. Polite, distant, dismissive. Margaret wasn't invited to their wedding. Daniel had said it would be small, just close friends. She believed him until she stumbled upon the photographs. 300 guests draped in couture gowns and silk ties. A Tuscan garden strung with lanterns glowing like fallen stars. Champagne towers cascading into crystal glasses. Margaret studied the images in silence, the screen's cold glow reflecting against her tired face. She had imagined being there, imagined fastening a flower to Daniel's lapel, imagined catching his eyes across the crowd when vows were spoken. Instead, she sat at home alone, her hands folded in her lap, as though trying to hold herself together. And still she loved. Every year, without fail, Margaret mailed him a birthday card, her handwriting careful and steady, the ink pressed with all the affection she wasn't allowed to speak. At Christmas, she baked cookies wrapped in red ribbon and sent them by post, even when she wasn't sure if they were ever eaten. When Daniel changed jobs or received another accolade, she wrote letters, pages of pride and encouragement, each one ending with the same words, "I am so proud of you. Love, Mom." She never asked for replies. Sometimes weeks would pass before she received a brief thank you, typed instead of written, unsigned except for his name at the bottom. More often, there was silence. Margaret learned to take silence as an answer, the same way one learns to live with an old injury that aches on damp days but no longer surprises you. She kept her distance because that was what he seemed to want. Yet, in her heart, she carried a hope as stubborn as winter frost, the hope that one day Daniel would turn back, see her standing quietly at the edge of his world, and finally remember. But the years moved forward, each one pressing Margaret further out of the frame. When Daniel spoke about his life, he rarely mentioned her. In interviews, he credited mentors, colleagues, even childhood friends. Never the mother who had worked double shifts, skipped meals, and walked through snow in shoes that no longer kept out the cold. She became invisible not through malice, but through omission, a ghost hovering behind the applause. Margaret felt the erasure most during holidays. She would set a single plate at her table, sit with the flicker of candles, and watch shadows dance on the walls. Sometimes she made his favorite dishes, roast chicken or apple pie, not because he was coming, but because memory was easier to feed than absence. Her apartment grew quieter as the years went on, filled only with framed photographs of Daniel at every stage. Gap-toothed smile at 6, awkward teenage grin at 16, polished posture at 26. Those pictures never looked back at her. Margaret's love remained constant, steady as the tide, even when returned with nothing but indifference. It was not that Daniel hated her. Hatred requires passion, a tether of fire between two people. No, what she received was something colder. Neglect wrapped in civility, distance disguised as progress. She told herself it was enough to know he was safe, successful, admired, that her sacrifices had not been in vain, that she had raised a man who could walk into any room and command it. Yet beneath that justification lay a truth she could not silence. He had built a castle high in the sky and left her locked outside the gates. Every time Margaret slipped a card into the mailbox, every time she taped a package closed with trembling fingers, she whispered the same silent plea, "Please remember." And every time silence answered back, a small piece of her unraveled. She did not resent Daniel for chasing ambition. She resented the way ambition had swallowed memory whole, the way it had turned her decades of devotion into an afterthought. Margaret had given everything, her youth, her body, her spirit, to raise him. And in return, she had been erased from the story of his triumphs. The loneliness of motherhood is not the nights spent alone or the empty chair at the table. It is the knowledge that the very person you poured your life into has grown so tall, he no longer looks down to see the hands that lifted him. Margaret carried that weight quietly, as she always had. She did not complain, did not protest, did not demand. She held hope like a fragile flame cupped in between her palms, shielding it against winds that threatened to extinguish it. But even the most patient flame flickers when starved too long of air. The night Margaret Hale stepped into Sky Vista Tower, she carried not only her best navy blue dress, but also decades of invisible devotion stitched into every seam. The city shimmered below, lights scattered across glass and steel like jewels flung into darkness. Inside the rooftop restaurant, the air glowed with golden chandeliers, polished marble floors, and orchids hanging in perfect symmetry. A soft jazz melody floated through the space, the kind of music meant to make people feel wealthy simply by listening. Her name wasn't on the guest list. The hostess scanned the paper twice, her manicured fingers sliding down columns of names that did not include Margaret. Yet she could see him, Daniel, standing at the center of it all. His white smile flashed against the room's opulence, his arm draped around Vanessa's slender waist. Behind him a sign glittered, Dr. Daniel Hale, Neurosurgical Innovator of the Year. Glasses clinked, voices rose, and the applause was for him. Always for him. Margaret straightened her shoulders, smoothed the fabric of her dress, and walked forward. She whispered to herself that it was a misunderstanding. Surely her son would fix it. Surely his eyes, when they found hers, would soften into the boy she had once held in snow-dusted mittens. But Daniel looked at her the way a man looks at a stranger who has taken a wrong turn. He leaned closer, his voice low and even, polished for public spaces. "Mom, maybe it's better if you grab something downstairs. This place is a little upscale. I don't want you to feel out of place." Her lungs emptied, every syllable pressed against her like a stone. Vanessa's smile cut sharper than glass. "It's all right, Mrs. Hale. There's a little deli on the corner. That's probably more your speed." Margaret did not flinch. She smiled, because mothers know how to smile when the ground opens beneath them. She pretended to glance at the painting on the wall behind Daniel, a smear of black and red on white canvas, something likely called modern tension. Fitting, she thought. She did not cry, she simply nodded. "Of course, sweetheart, you enjoy." The air around her thinned as she turned and walked toward the elevator. Her coat, buttoned neatly, suddenly felt like the only thing holding her together. When the doors closed, she caught her reflection in the mirrored panel, a woman with tired eyes, soft lines at the corners of her mouth, hands folded around a purse like it was armor. She did not recognize the boy she had raised in the man upstairs, but she recognized herself, and for the first time in years, she felt the pulse of something sharp beneath the ache. Clarity, because Daniel might have claimed the rooftop. Vanessa might have claimed the spotlight. But the truth, the quiet truth neither of them knew, was this. The tower itself belonged to Margaret. Earlier that week, she had sat behind one-way glass with her attorney, Robert Lang, as Daniel signed the lease for his clinic. 10 years, steep penalties for early termination. He had signed without hesitation, never asking who owned the building, never caring who held the deed beneath his rising empire. His pen pressed her name into every page, though he never saw it. So when he told her she did not belong, when Vanessa pointed her toward a deli like a servant dismissed from the table, Margaret remembered. She remembered whose ground they stood on. She remembered the foundation she had built with silent labor. Skipped meals, patched shoes, and nights she spent folding laundry by the glow of a single lamp. They thought she was invisible, but invisibility has power. As the elevator carried her down, Margaret inhaled slowly, letting the humiliation settle, then transform. Not into rage. Rage is loud, messy, fleeting. What filled her instead was resolve, cool and steady. She had been erased, but not destroyed. That night on the train ride home, she pressed her coat tighter across her chest, not from cold, but from the need to hold her pieces together until she reached her quiet apartment. She walked inside, switched on the lamp, and stood before the bookshelf lined with photographs of Daniel, his 6th birthday, frosting on his nose, the knitted sweater she had stayed up 2 nights to finish because he had wanted one they couldn't afford, the boy who once promised to buy her a house someday. Now he had everything. And still she had been told to leave. Margaret sat at her table, the silence pressing in. For a long while she did not move. Then, like a whisper rising from the marrow of her bones, a single truth surfaced. She was done begging for a seat at anyone else's table. Because while Daniel dined above the city, Margaret held the deed beneath his feet. And that was only the beginning. So let me ask you, would you stay to hear how a forgotten mother turned her silence into power that could not be ignored? If you want to know what happens when the erased finally take back their place, keep listening. And don't forget to like, share, and follow along. When the library downsized in 2005, Margaret Hale walked away carrying a cardboard box of belongings and a decision that would alter the rest of her life. Her severance check was modest, nothing anyone would have looked twice at, but she added it to the quiet savings she had built from years of frugality, extra shifts, skipped meals, the coins she slipped into an old jar instead of into her own pockets. To most, it was spare change. To her, it was possibility. She reached out to Helen Brooks, a friend from the circulation desk who had since found her way into real estate. Helen introduced her to a circle of women who gathered not in boardrooms, but in diners with sticky tables, the smell of coffee lingering over piles of spreadsheets. They were widows, single mothers, secretaries who had learned to read contracts the way others read novels. They called themselves investors, though the world never bothered to give them that title. They pooled what little they had, and Margaret found herself stepping into a new world where each square foot mattered, where every line on a lease could mean survival or loss. It started small: parking lots, storage units, small apartment buildings tucked on side streets. Margaret studied everything: property taxes, maintenance fees, zoning laws. She highlighted every clause until the pages looked like stained glass. The others joked that she had the eyes of a hawk, catching details no one else bothered to notice. Quietly, steadily, her confidence grew. Then one day, Sky Vista Tower appeared on the horizon, an aging high-rise in the downtown core marked for redevelopment, its steel bones still sturdy, but its future uncertain. Many dismissed it as too risky, too large, but something inside Margaret whispered otherwise. She had spent her life building stability for others. Maybe it was time to build something of her own. Pooling resources with her group, she stepped into the deal. They didn't buy headlines, they bought leverage. Sky Vista became the crown jewel of their holdings, managed through a third-party firm under the anonymity of an LLC. Her name never appeared on a plaque, never shown in silver letters across the lobby wall, but tucked away in a navy blue box beneath a stack of recipe clippings and church bulletins sat the documents proving otherwise. Margaret held 38% of the company. She wasn't a tenant. She wasn't a guest. She was an owner. For years, she kept it hidden, even from Daniel, especially from Daniel. She told herself it was to protect him, to let him build without feeling beholden to her. But deep down, she knew another truth. She was afraid. Afraid that if he learned she had built something substantial, he would only see her as useful again, not worthy. Afraid that the illusion of respect would vanish the moment money entered the conversation. And perhaps most of all, afraid that he had never valued her at all, only what she could provide. So she stayed silent. She let Daniel believe she was just a retired librarian, a woman of modest means who lived alone in a small apartment. She sent cards and baked cookies, never hinting at the contracts she signed, the decisions she made, the quiet empire she managed with steady hands. He thought she lived on the sidelines, but in truth, she had been moving pieces on the board long before he ever stepped into a surgical theater. The night of the rooftop humiliation, when he told her she did not belong, that silence became her weapon. He stood there, polished and proud, never realizing that the ground beneath him was hers. Every wall, every pane of glass, every inch of marble was tied to her name in ways he had never bothered to discover. He had looked through her as if she were invisible, never understanding that his success was now anchored to the woman he had dismissed. Invisibility has its own power. It listens, it observes, it waits. Margaret had not plotted revenge. That wasn't her nature. But humiliation has a way of sharpening memory. As she walked home that night, past flickering streetlights, enclosed shop fronts, she realized she was done waiting for gratitude that would never come. Daniel didn't need more of her sacrifice. He needed the consequences of ignoring it. The following week, she stopped outside Sky Vista Tower. From the sidewalk, she looked up at its glittering windows. High above, on the 40th floor, her son's name shone in silver. Hale Neurological Institute. Her name wasn't on the sign, but it didn't need to be. It was etched into the foundation. In the lobby, she spotted Carmen Diaz, a woman she had folded church brochures with years earlier, now part of the cleaning staff. Carmen recognized her, eyes widening in surprise. "Miss Margaret," she said softly, "what are you doing here?" Margaret's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Just checking on something I own," she answered. They shared a look, one of quiet understanding. Daniel thought she was unworthy of his table. But the truth was this. His table stood on a floor she helped pay for, under a ceiling she built, inside a building she claimed piece by piece with years of invisible labor. And now, bound by a 10-year lease, Daniel Hale's empire was tethered to her. She wasn't angry, not yet, but she was finished being invisible. The first time Margaret Hale whispered it, her voice was barely audible. "You don't deserve me anymore." She was alone in her apartment, the light low, her coat still draped over the chair from the night she was turned away at her son's celebration. The words trembled out like a secret she had buried for decades. Yet once spoken, they hung in the air with a weight that could not be undone. Margaret had built her life on silence. Silence at the library while shelving endless rows of books. Silence at the dinner table when her son grew too busy to visit. Silence at weddings and ceremonies she was never invited to. Silence had been her shield, her disguise, her prison, her... But now, in the quiet of that Wednesday morning, silence finally turned into truth. She rose before dawn as she always had, her body conditioned to decades of duty. But there was no breakfast to prepare. No child waiting at the table. She boiled water for tea and sat in the darkness, listening to the radiator tick and the faint hum of traffic far below. And then, with deliberate clarity, she said it again. "You don't deserve me." This time she did not whisper. She spoke it like a fact carved into stone. The power in those words startled her, not because they were cruel, but because they were honest. Mothers like Margaret make excuses for years. He's busy. He's stressed. He didn't mean it. They soften insults into misunderstandings, transform neglect into necessity. But the truth, once admitted, refuses to be reshaped. Daniel hadn't simply overlooked her. He had chosen to erase her. That realization was not fire. It was ice. Cold, steady, clarifying. Margaret crossed to her closet and pulled out a navy blue box she hadn't touched in years. Inside, beneath folded church bulletins and yellowed recipes, rested a folder marked Private Investments. It had been her secret life, the one Daniel never asked about and she never offered. Inside were deeds, contracts, tax filings, lease agreements, evidence of the empire she had quietly built, while the world assumed she was nothing more than a retired librarian. For the first time, she allowed herself to see it not as survival but as accomplishment. She had joined a group of women who once met at diners with refill coffee, swapping spreadsheets like other people swapped recipes. She had studied clauses, caught errors, negotiated percentages. She had turned pennies into square footage, hardship into leverage. And she had done it all while raising a boy who would one day tell her she did not belong at his table. Margaret stacked the documents neatly, her fingers brushing over signatures that bore her name. "You don't deserve me," she repeated, this time to the paper itself, as though to remind herself she was more than forgotten birthdays and unanswered letters. She was a builder, a survivor, a woman who had carved dignity from scarcity. The next step was not confrontation but structure. She called Robert Lang, an attorney she had worked with years ago to help a friend in a rental dispute. He remembered her not because she was flashy, but because she had arrived with spreadsheets typed and highlighted. every figure accounted for. Robert listened carefully as Margaret laid out her holdings, her ownership share in Sky Vista Tower, the contracts binding Daniel's clinic to her name. When she finished, he leaned back, brows raised in quiet astonishment. "Miss Hale," he said, "you've built yourself a small empire." She didn't smile with pride. She simply nodded. "I want to protect it." Together, they restructured her assets into a trust, safeguarding her position, ensuring she held full authority should she ever decide to reveal her role or keep it concealed. Robert drafted documents with precision, but Margaret's hands were steady as she signed. For the first time in decades, she wasn't erasing herself. She was writing herself back into the story. That night, she updated her email signature. It no longer read Margaret Hale, retired librarian. With a few keystrokes, it became Margaret M. Hale, principal investor, Hale Brooks Holdings. No confetti fell, no announcement was made. Just a quiet declaration, private yet powerful. It felt like breathing clean air after years of holding her lungs tight. Margaret realized she no longer needed Daniel's recognition. She no longer waited for an apology or a thank you that would never come. What she needed was her own acknowledgement, her own voice, her own presence in the mirror staring back at her. And that presence no longer belonged to an invisible mother waiting at the edge of someone else's life. It belonged to her. So let me tell you, if you've ever felt erased, stay close. Because what happens next is proof that silence can turn into power, and that the very ground others dismiss you from may one day rise beneath your feet. Keep listening, and if this story stirs something inside you, share it, like it, let someone else hear it too. You never know who might need to. The truth slipped into the open the way water seeps through cracks, quietly, without permission. It began with something small, almost laughably ordinary. A maintenance request. Daniel Hale's clinic needed repairs to the HVAC system, and the request filtered upward through the building's management software. On the paperwork, there it was, printed plainly in black ink. Owner, Margaret M. Hale. The receptionist forwarded the chain by mistake to an intern at a local paper who had once interviewed Daniel during the early days of his career. The name caught his eye. A search, a phone call, and the dots connected themselves. The headline arrived 2 days later. Evans Tower owned by former librarian, mother of its star tenant. The photograph was unglamorous. Spadium, somenos. Margaret stepping out of a cab with a reusable grocery bag, her coat buttoned against the wind. No makeup, no stage smile, no attempt at performance. Just a woman in motion, caught between errands. But beneath the photograph ran a subhead that pierced like a blade. Sources confirm neurosurgeon Daniel Hale's mother holds majority stake in the building housing his private clinic. Margaret stared at the article on her screen, the letters swimming as her tea cooled beside her. She had spent years hiding her name, tucking her accomplishments into boxes and drawers, avoiding the spotlight as though it might burn her alive. Now the truth stood in public daylight, undeniable. The story spread, not in a wildfire blaze, but in a steady climb, a slow hum that gathered voices. Women whispered in grocery store lines. Retired co-workers from the library called with shaky admiration. At church, old acquaintances shook her hand with new reverence. "She built the rooftop he stands on," someone said. "She raised him, then outsmarted him," another whispered. Margaret did not comment. She did not grant interviews or post on social media. The truth finally did not need her to defend it. For Daniel, though, silence became suffocating. Calls poured into his office. Patients asked if it was true. Colleagues chuckled behind closed doors. Journalists wanted statements. Invitations to galas went missing. The pristine image he had polished for years, self-made, untethered, refined, cracked beneath the weight of a mother he had dismissed. The irony was bitter. Margaret hadn't lifted a finger against him. She hadn't spoken a word. She had simply stopped covering for him, and the world filled in the gaps. Vanessa's composure wavered first. Margaret saw her in a grocery aisle weeks later, makeup perfect, voice low and tight. "He isn't sleeping," Vanessa admitted, eyes darting toward the shelves. "People are asking questions about the building, about you." Margaret tilted her head, calm and unflinching. "I didn't say a word, Vanessa. I didn't have to." The younger woman blinked, lips parting with the unspoken protest, but no sound followed. In that silence, Margaret felt no triumph, only the steady rhythm of justice unforced. Back at Sky Vista Tower, whispers grew among staff and tenants. Margaret's name carried through hallways, sometimes with awe, sometimes with disbelief. Carmen Diaz, the cleaning woman she'd once folded brochures beside, squeezed her hand when they passed in the lobby. "It's about time they knew," she whispered. Margaret only nodded. Daniel, meanwhile, struggled under the new weight. He had built his reputation on ambition, refinement, and detachment. Now people looked closer. Former staff muttered that he rarely said thank you. Old classmates remembered how he kept his mother at arm's length. One by one, these stories strung together like beads, weaving into a narrative he could no longer control. Margaret watched none of it unfold directly. She stayed in her apartment, tended to her plants, painted small canvases in the evenings, and read in the quiet hours of dawn. Yet everywhere her presence was felt. She had been erased for years. Now she was undeniable. And still she was not vengeful. That surprised her most of all. She had expected, perhaps, to feel satisfaction watching Daniel falter. Instead, she felt only release. For the first time, she was no longer responsible for protecting his image, for smoothing over his neglect with polite excuses. She poured herself a glass of wine one evening, turned on the jazz station, and let the saxophone curl around her like smoke. No phone calls demanding her time. No letters asking her to intervene. Just stillness. Daniel tried reaching out. Texts, a voicemail, even a letter drafted by his legal team asking that ownership details remain discreet for the sake of patient confidence. Margaret read the letter twice, then laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but the laugh of someone who has finally set down a burden carried too long. For decades, she had asked only for recognition, for a place at the table she had built with her hands. Now the table itself was hers, and the world knew it. She wasn't erased anymore. She was written in bold, whether Daniel liked it or not. The morning Margaret Hale sat at her kitchen table and whispered, "You don't deserve me." She felt something shift inside her chest, as if a door long sealed had finally cracked open. For decades, she had lived bent toward her son's needs. Her voice softened into near silence, her sacrifices tucked away like old linens no one bothered to unfold. Now, the words carried her into a new season, one not defined by what she had given, but by what she would reclaim. She began quietly. Margaret filled her apartment with small rituals of joy she hadn't allowed herself in years. Fresh flowers on the table. Sunflowers one week, lavender the next. A candle lit each evening, not for company, not for holidays, but simply because she enjoyed the glow. She signed up for a beginner's art class at the community center. The room smelled of acrylic paint and glue sticks, plastic tablecloths protecting scarred tables. She picked up a brush, her hand unsteady, her canvas clumsy, and yet her heart startled with something close to delight. Every Friday afternoon, she returned to that class. She painted bowls of fruit, crooked vases, messy skies streaked with improbable colors. No one applauded, no one critiqued. For the first time in years, she was creating something for herself, not offering it to Daniel, not sacrificing it for his future. It was hers. The balance of her life tilted further when she attended a panel at a local bookstore. The Cost of Silence, Women's Invisible Labor. The title alone made her breath catch. She sat in the audience listening to women speak, grandmothers, single mothers, daughters, all describing how they had given everything and been seen as nothing. The words pressed against her chest until, when the microphone passed, Margaret found herself standing. "I spent most of my life being good," she said softly, her voice trembling, but clear, quiet, accommodating, useful. And then I realized being useful isn't the same as being valued. The room hushed. A woman in her 60s with kind eyes reached out as Margaret sat down, whispering, "You put into words what I never could." That night, Margaret walked home beneath the glow of streetlights, feeling taller than she had in years. She had not revealed her name, had not told them of the tower, or the lease, or the son who had erased her. She had simply spoken the truth, and that truth was enough. Back at her apartment, she opened the old box every mother keeps, the one filled with drawings, cards, small scraps of childhood love. There, between a crayon Father's Day card, and a faded spelling bee ribbon, she placed a new item, a folded page from her notebook. On it, in her steady hand, she had written, "Being useful isn't the same as being valued." Days later, she wrote a letter to Daniel, not to send, not to frame, just to clear the silence inside her chest. "Dear Daniel," it began, "I want you to know I remember everything. I remember your bare feet running down the hallway at 4 years old, terrified I had left when I'd only stepped outside for the mail. I remember the way you promised to buy me a house one day because you saw how hard I worked. I remember the graduation sash you didn't want to wear, but that I saved for anyway. I kept every promise I made to you, but somewhere along the way, you decided I no longer mattered. You didn't push me away all at once. You chipped at me little by little until I was edited out of your life. I am not angry, Daniel. Anger would mean I'm still holding space for you. I'm not. I gave too much. Not just my money, not just my labor, but my silence. And silence is a kind of permission. I'm done being quiet." She folded the letter gently and placed it in a drawer under her dish towels. It wasn't for him. It was for her. That evening, she sat on the balcony wrapped in a blanket, the sky fading from blush to indigo. She didn't replay conversations. She didn't ache for an apology. She simply breathed. The peace was fragile but real, like glass that finally stopped shattering. For the first time in her life, Margaret wasn't waiting. She wasn't hoping for Daniel's recognition, wasn't shrinking into silence. She was standing in her own story, not as a mother erased, but as a woman who had reclaimed her voice. And this was only the beginning. If you've ever written words you never planned to send, if you've ever needed to free yourself by speaking what could not be said aloud, then you already know how powerful this moment is. Stay with me, because Margaret's next steps will prove that once you reclaim your worth, the world can no longer ignore you. Like this story, share it, and let it reach someone else who may need to hear it today. By the time spring softened the edges of winter, Margaret Hale no longer felt tethered to the silence that had once defined her. The city pulsed with the rush of ambition, but she found herself drawn to quieter places. On the edge of town, a lake stretched wide beneath the sky, its surface calm enough to mirror clouds. Margaret visited first on a whim, carrying a thermos of coffee and an old folding chair. She returned the next day and the day after that, until it became her sanctuary. The lake was not grand, not lined with estates or crowded with sailboats. It was modest, circled by tall grasses and willow trees dipping their branches into the water. Ducks skimmed across the ripples, children tossed breadcrumbs from the shore, and joggers traced the path that curved like a ribbon around its banks. Yet to Margaret, it felt like the most magnificent cathedral, open, infinite, holy in its stillness. She brought her paints with her. Sitting beneath a willow, she set canvas against easel and dipped her brush into colors she had once been too tired to notice. Cobalt skies, emerald reeds, the shimmering silver of the water. Her strokes were uneven, her technique imperfect, but the act of capturing beauty on canvas filled her with a quiet triumph. She was no longer painting to prove anything. She was painting simply because she could. Margaret's days settled into rhythm. Mornings she spent at the lake, afternoons in her apartment, managing her investments with Robert Lang's help, evenings surrounded by books stacked like old companions. She joined a small circle of women from her art class for coffee on Saturdays. They laughed, swapped stories of marriages that had frayed, of children who had moved far away, of dreams they had only just begun to chase at 60. Margaret listened, and for once she didn't feel like a ghost at the edge of someone else's life. She belonged. News of her ownership still hovered in the city, but the buzz was no longer sharp. The headlines had quieted, and Margaret let them fade without interference. She did not need fame. She did not need recognition. The lake reminded her daily, dignity is not in being seen, but in seeing yourself clearly. Occasionally, Daniel's name appeared in newspapers, an award, a lecture, a photograph beside Vanessa at some glittering event. Margaret glanced at them the way one glances at weather reports, detached, acknowledging but no longer shaping her plans around them. The ache had dulled. She no longer whispered, "Please remember," when she slipped cards into the mailbox. She no longer waited for a reply that never came. Her love for him remained, but it was no longer a wound. It was a scar, healed but undeniable. One afternoon, while walking back from the lake, Margaret passed a bakery window filled with golden loaves. She stopped, remembering the years she had baked bread at midnight to save a few dollars, her hands raw from kneading dough. Without hesitation, she stepped inside and bought 2 loaves still warm from the oven. Back home, she sliced one, spread butter that melted into the soft crumb, and ate slowly, savoring each bite. It tasted of freedom, the kind that comes when you no longer apologize for enjoying what you've earned. In May, she rented a small cabin near the lake for a week. The walls smelled faintly of cedar, and the nights echoed with frogs and crickets. Margaret sat on the porch each evening, a blanket across her lap, watching the horizon fade into indigo. She wrote in her notebook, not lists or ledgers this time, but thoughts. Fragments of poems, small memories, hopes for the years ahead. One page she filled with a single sentence written over and over, as though engraving it into her bones. I am not erased. When she returned to the city, her apartment no longer felt like a cell, but like a place she had chosen. She placed one of her lake paintings above the mantel, its colors bold, unapologetic. Visitors paused before it, surprised at the vibrancy, at the certainty of her brushstrokes. Margaret only smiled. She did not seek reconciliation with Daniel, nor did she slam the door against it. The balance of her life no longer hinged on his choices. For the first time, she lived not in reaction to his absence, but in the fullness of her own presence. At the lake, she had discovered a truth deeper than ambition, deeper than resentment. She had discovered herself, and that, she realized, was enough. Autumn came gently, painting the trees around the lake in shades of copper and gold. Margaret Hale sat on the wooden bench near the water's edge, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, her hands steady as she traced the reflection of branches against the rippling surface. She had come to love this place. The way the world slowed down, the way silence no longer felt like absence but like belonging. Her life had become quiet, but not empty. Each morning she woke with purpose, small and deliberate. She brewed her coffee, watered the plants lined on her windowsill, and planned her day not around obligations but around joy. The old ache that had once haunted her, those unanswered letters, the vacant holidays, the rooftop humiliation, had softened into memory. It was still part of her, but it no longer owned her. One afternoon, while Margaret was returning from the lake with her easel slung over her shoulder, she found an envelope slipped beneath her apartment door. Daniel's handwriting covered the front, careful and restrained. For a moment, her chest tightened, but she didn't rush. She set her things aside, brewed tea, and only then opened it. The letter was brief. Mother, I know you saw the headlines. I didn't understand how much you had built, how much you carried in silence. I suppose I should have. I don't know how to say this without sounding selfish, but the truth is I need to see you, Daniel. Margaret read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope. She felt no triumph, no sting, only clarity. Once, such a letter would have set her heart racing with hope. Now it was simply paper. She didn't call him. She didn't write back. Instead, she slipped the envelope into the same drawer that held the unsent letter she had written weeks earlier. 2 letters, his and hers, resting together, never crossing paths. At the lake the next morning, she painted the rising sun, spreading its light across the water. The canvas glowed with streaks of amber and violet, imperfect yet alive. When she stepped back to study it, Margaret realized the painting was not of the lake at all. It was of herself, of the life she had reclaimed, of the light she had found after years of shadow. She signed her name in the corner with a firm stroke, M. Hale. For decades she had been invisible, her work folded into her son's story, her sacrifices hidden beneath his triumphs. Now her name stood alone, enough in itself. Weeks later, her art teacher invited her to submit a piece for a local gallery exhibition. Margaret hesitated, then chose the lake painting. On the night of the opening, she stood among strangers who paused before her work, murmuring quietly. No one knew her history. No one whispered about towers or clinics or headlines. They only saw the colors, the light, the reflection of something deeper. For the first time, Margaret felt fully present in a room, not as someone's mother, not as someone erased, but as herself. When the evening ended, she stepped outside, pulling her coat around her shoulders. The city hummed with its endless rhythm, but Margaret felt no need to chase it. She had built her own rhythm, one measured not by applause or recognition, but by peace. That night, as she sat at her kitchen table, she opened her notebook and wrote a single line: I am not waiting anymore. She closed the book, blew out the candle, and allowed herself a long, steady breath. The silence no longer hurt. It held her, cradled her, promised her that the years ahead would belong to her alone. Margaret Hale had been forgotten, dismissed, erased. But she had lived long enough to write herself back into the world, not through vengeance, but through presence. And that, she knew, was the truest victory. So if you are listening, if you have ever felt invisible in the very life you built, remember Margaret's story. Share it, carry it. Let it remind someone else that silence can be broken, that erasure can be undone, and that it is never too late to reclaim your place in the world.